Hey everybody, just a heads up, you know how YouTube is with copyright, so I'm going to try and limit my usage of actual clips from the show in favor of still frames. Alright, well, the Twisted Metal TV show has come and gone. Some have been anticipating it, some have been dreading it, but now we've all seen it, and it's... well, we'll get to that. Opinion seems to be mixed on this show, as I've gotten an equal amount of comments telling me it's the greatest thing ever, and people telling me it's an atrocity worthy of Uwe Boll. I was definitely not looking forward to the show pretty much at all, because initial first impressions were decent but not great, but as I saw more of it from the trailers, it really started to strike me as a show that seemed really stupid and cringeworthy, but not in a fun way. My main hang-up, aside from it being good, was whether or not they were going to be making a show that was undisputedly Twisted Metal, or if they were just using Twisted Metal imagery and plastering it over a rather bare-bones skeleton that could have been anything, because how the hell do you adapt something that has never really attempted to have a coherent overarching story? Well, mostly. There's really not a lot to pull from, so it's really hard to make it both lore accurate and something that's coherent, and that especially becomes apparent when you take into account that this show is a post-apocalyptic story, something the series has never really been. Set 20 years after every computer and electronic in the world simultaneously malfunctioned and caused a full systemic collapse, we follow John Doe, who's a milkman. Now, milkman in this universe is a catch-all term referring to delivery man. After everything went to hell, many cities walled themselves off and threw out all the undesirables, letting them fend for themselves. But of course, these settlements need to survive, and so they rely on milkmen to deliver them important items, from insulin to dog food. The main thing left behind outside of these walled cities are cars and weapons, so naturally the two were combined, turning the outer world into Mad Max. However, the leader of New San Francisco, Raven, notices that John Doe seems to be the only milkman who has come back multiple times, so as a test to him, she tasks him with picking up a very important package from New Chicago, which is halfway across the country. And if he makes it back in 10 days, he will be given the ultimate prize in this world, the ability to live inside a walled city. But there's various hints that there's more to this that she's not telling him. So with all that said, is this a story that took advantage of the Twisted Metal IP, or could this have literally been anything? Well, if I'm being honest, it's sort of half and half. Sometimes it felt like its own thing, but there were definitely some aspects about the Twisted Metal TV show that felt distinctly Twisted Metal. Especially in the characters' backstories. John Doe is an amnesiac, and even though they race-swapped Agent Stone from black to white, they still maintained his backstory, but we'll get to that in a moment. Mike and Stu are another example of characters who are definitely different from their brief portrayal in Twisted Metal 2, but still managed to maintain the spirit of the characters, being a couple of fun-loving, goofy best friends. But then you have some other questionable choices, like Bloody Mary, who went from psycho bride looking for Mr. Right to a full-on psycho ex-girlfriend who acts unsettlingly like Harley Quinn. Or most perplexingly to me is Raven. Now Raven was this goth chick in Twisted Metal Black implied to be a witch, but instead here she's the leader of New San Francisco and has enough power and influence to control literally everyone. She also looks unsettlingly like former Nightwish singer Tarja Turunen. She's seen sewing a voodoo doll at one point, but otherwise, she's essentially just Kathleen from The Last of Us. In fact, I'm just gonna say right off the bat, I was getting a lot of Last of Us vibes from this show. Post-apocalypse, walled-off cities, smugglers who moved packages from city to city, and the main character tasked with carrying an important package across the country. They even break out expository flashbacks quite a bit. The release window of the Twisted Metal TV show is too close to the release window of The Last of Us on HBO for them to be in any way linked, but it's possible the Twisted Metal TV show takes some inspiration from the game The Last of Us. It's especially eerie though, because the electronic apocalypse happens in 2002 in Twisted Metal, whereas The Last of Us TV show had the Cordyceps outbreak in 2003. How funny would it be if these shows were in the same universe and, like, they recovered from the electronic apocalypse of 2002, only for a zombie apocalypse to happen the next year? My first impressions of this show were not exactly good. The first several minutes were basically non-stop quips. Wait a minute, Twisted Metal exists inside Twisted Metal? Well anyways, early on there's a lot of really forced and cringeworthy attempts at humor which mostly fall flat for me.
He's new.
A virgin? Oh, I got a big package for you.
It makes the dialogue seem really forced and try-hard. Like, the screenwriter will explode if they don't reach a certain joke-to-minute ratio, and I would say it's several minutes before a single joke even landed for me. Is that indicative of the entire series? Yes and no. The scripting is overall a bit of a mixed bag. I wouldn't say this series is attempting to be high art, it's definitely attempting to be more schlocky, which I appreciate. Ain't no way you can turn this into Oscar bait and have anybody take it seriously. That said, I feel like the dramatic elements genuinely drew me in most of the time. The problem is, the overbearing humor is definitely taken on a case-by-case basis from scene to scene.
Oh, nothing goes to waste. Even our waste.
You see, we take our duties and we turn them. We get it.
Some individual segments in various episodes were just non-stop attempts at humor to the point of being groan-worthy. For example, when they finally make their way across the country to New Chicago and they find their way into this mysterious tunnel where their package is, they're just quipping the entire time. And sometimes they sacrifice what could have been a good dramatic moment for the sake of humor. The torture scene springs to mind, where you think they're going to rough up John Doe and Quiet, only for them to be subjected to having to fill out DMV forms all the while Barbie Girl is blasted at maximum volume in the background. That was probably the hardest I rolled my eyes in the entire show. I know some people call this Marvel humor, but I think it's a problem universally in script writing. There's a time and place for everything, and I feel like when the situation calls for it, the excessive humor is fine. There's even a good number of times that I laughed, but less is more, guys, and I'd say the humor is like 1/3 well written, 1/3 awful, and 1/3 general banter dialogue that at least doesn't feel out of place. Still, the dramatic elements mostly hit the mark. Like, there's a scene fairly early on where one of the main characters is covered in her own brother's brains and then branded. It's pretty grim. This is the character that would come to be known as Quiet, played by Stephanie Beatriz of Brooklyn Nine-Nine fame.
It sucked.
I was a bit iffy about introducing a completely original character into main supporting character status. You have a lot of characters to mine from, so you better damn well have a character that's good enough to make me overlook the OC status, because I'd rather not have another Cole Young on my hands. I'd say she's probably the better of the two characters between her and John Doe.
Then the exit is... Oh, they have a footlocker!
As I speculated in the pre-release, he's more or less just a blank slate character that they could paint into any sort of characterization that they wanted. So he's a quippy character, sometimes to an obnoxious degree, who has amnesia and loves his car to the point of risking his life for it multiple times. Not exactly an Oscar-worthy performance, but I think Anthony Mackie has enough charisma that he can carry the performance.
Poor bastard betrayed by his butthole.
Quiet, on the other hand, actually does have a great deal of characterization, and it's a pretty compelling arc.
Get on your knees, you greasy little piglet, and lick my soiled boots.
Her and her brother, who looks unsettlingly like a more rugged Mustafa Ali, were living a tough but safe life until Quiet got them what they thought was a good deal. Work in Orange County for 4 years, then they got their own piece of land. Unfortunately, this is a community that punishes even the slightest infraction with literal removal of body parts that the rich people will then wear as jewelry. But after being deeply traumatized for a couple of years, they finally have had enough and run away after killing a couple of people. This then results in them going on the road as scavengers, which eventually ends in Quiet's brother's death. So multiple years of trauma followed by the death of her brother, of which she blames herself for, made her incredibly closed off and standoffish, using her crudeness to push people away because she's so broken that she can't get close to anybody, and her story is largely based around her letting go, of her trauma, of her brother, of everything. It's very compelling. In fact, in a great bit of metaphorical storytelling, her letting go is captured in this moment of her trying to pick up a gas canister that's too heavy for her. And she refuses to let go. She even refuses to share the load, and that simple act of letting go and letting John Doe help her is symbolic of her letting go of all of that. Although I will say that whole episode where she does let go, episode 6, is probably the least interesting episode. It's by no means bad, but it reminds me of Left Behind from The Last of Us. As necessary as it is to the overall story, you don't need to watch it again after watching it the first time. Mostly because outside of Quiet's flashbacks, it's really repetitive. They're trapped in a burger joint due to a Watkins storm, a reference to Watkins Harbor from Twisted Metal 2012, and so it's essentially a bottle episode. The episode consists of them arguing, having sex, arguing, having sex, arguing, and then leaving. I'm assuming this is one of those episodes where they only built one set and wanted to save a bit of money, and it's funny, the dynamic in the episode is kind of their dynamic through the entire show. One person makes the other mad, then they have an extended period of trying to make it up to the other person, then they finally make up, repeat. This continues pretty much through the entire season, although ironically, I think episode 6, despite being repetitive and not particularly rewatchable, is actually the most impressively shot episode. I think the lower production value and bubble episode structure allowed them to try some different shooting styles, because this episode has some pretty striking visuals as far as lighting and camera movements are concerned, like representing John's disorientation from just having woken up by having the camera follow him as he sits up. There are a number of shots that stuck out in my mind from this episode. It's not to say the rest of the series is shot or edited badly, but it's more standard than anything. There are a few standout shots, like that roll focus when they got to New Chicago, but most of the series doesn't stand out as far as how it was shot. But let's be honest, for those of you who haven't watched the show, you probably just want to know if they did Sweet Tooth justice. I will admit, based on the trailers, I was really afraid they were going to ruin Sweet Tooth. Incidentally, we all know his name is Needles, but he's only ever referred to as Sweet Tooth in this show, probably because that's the name most casual audiences know him by. Sweet Tooth has always been the most iconic Twisted Metal character and vehicle, and due to the nature of how Twisted Metal is presented, we never really got any instance where he was fully fleshed out. Except arguably TM 2012. But when I saw the Thong Song trailer, I almost died of cringe. But to be honest, I don't know why they chose that as the thing to put front and center in the advertisements, because it's kind of a standout moment in that it's the only truly bad Sweet Tooth moment, I think. In the rest of the series, he's awesome and makes every scene he's in. It makes me believe that whoever was in charge of the advertisements for the series either had no idea what they were doing or just straight up hated Twisted Metal and wanted to sabotage it.
I really enjoy my work. Hey, hold this.
Now, he's the most iconic character, as I said, so it wouldn't have been smart for them to make him into a straight-up villain, so they kind of did the best possible thing with him. They made him into an amoral force of nature who craves validation. You see, he was a child actor forced into acting by his oblivious mother and abusive stepfather, and when the audience turned on him in favor of his co-star, a dog, he snapped and killed the dog live in studio. You may say that's horrible, and I wouldn't argue, but to me it's presented with the tongue far enough in the cheek that it comes across as funny in an awful way instead of just plain awful. Plus, like I said, he's not necessarily supposed to be the good guy. So he was sent to Blackfield Insane Asylum for many years until the collapse happened, so now he's a complete murderous lunatic, but all he craves is the love of an audience that he never got. So depending on where you fall on that spectrum, he either helps you or kills you. And it makes him equal parts entertaining murderer and showman. His physical acting is dramatic and flamboyant, but he also manages to stay completely and utterly frightening at the same time. One of my favorite examples of humor in the entire history of Twisted Metal is this moment here.
I had to decide. It took me all of 10 seconds. Let's face it, boys and girls. A man has to have his priorities.
It's funny to us as a passive observer, but to be in that situation, you wouldn't be laughing, you'd be terrified, and I feel like that's the real balance they get here. Within the context of the universe, he's a terrifying motherfucker you wouldn't want to cross, but when there's a separation of a TV screen, we have enough detachment that his actions can be funny, so they manage to maintain the murderous tone even if he's being completely ridiculous. Will Arnett's voice is great, and the physical acting of Samoa Joe is just fantastic, and when they zoom into the mask, it's amazing how much emotion he can convey just with the eyes. Like I said before, they couldn't have found a more perfect actor to be Sweet Tooth than Samoa Joe, all because he's fat! Sweet Tooth is definitely the best acted and best presented character in the show, which is not to say the acting is bad in the show. At worst, the acting is passable. Well, except for the child actor who plays young John Doe, that kid needs work. But I'm sure he'll get there, he has time. But Sweet Tooth stands head and shoulders above the rest. He's also responsible for my absolute favorite joke in the series.
Need a hand? Oh, I found this one lying around, so you'll have to get your own.
And I absolutely adore the opposite-attract relationship that Sweet Tooth has with Stu of all people. Stu of Mike and Stu fame. Mike and Stu in this universe are a couple of guards who got thrown out of their encampment for falling asleep on the job, so they end up working with the main antagonist to get by. Mike takes to it pretty well because he doesn't mind killing to survive. Stu, on the other hand, is a very timid man with a big heart who just can't bring himself to kill, driving a wedge between the two. Stu is just this big teddy bear with a heart of gold who's so pleasant anytime he's on screen, and you just want to give him a hug. You want nothing bad to happen to him. But you may be wondering at this point, if Sweet Tooth isn't the main antagonistic force, then who is? Well, this is actually where I think they take the hardest deviation from the games tonally, but in such a way that I actually really like what they did. You see, in the games, when you have the overarching villain of Calypso and the tournament setup, good or bad, every character is the protagonist of their own story. But in the standard TV format, you need clear heroes and villains. Calypso can't be the ultimate bad guy 24/7, so the main minute-to-minute villains are actually this police force led by Agent Stone. No, not that Agent Stone. They decided to make Agent Stone from Twisted Metal Black into this fascist monster who wants to bring back order to the United States, or the divided states, by instituting his own police state. He sees all crime as equally bad, from petty theft to murder, so he believes in total compliance and total order. He's hard as nails on the surface, but secretly he's a complete and total fraud. The episode where I started to actually get into the show was honestly episode 3. I didn't really pay any mind to when they were explaining that Agent Stone took out a cabal of terrorists by himself.
This guy stepped up himself and single-handedly annihilated everybody with extreme prejudice.
You see, that's the thing that made him into a legendary officer of the law. But then they showed his backstory, and when the fall of civilization happened, he was just some lowly mall cop who had completely given up. Then when Agent Stone went in to stop a food heist in a restaurant, they all poke fun at him because they recognize him as a pathetic mall cop. Then he snaps and starts shooting. Then we see the bloody teddy bear. That was the first true oh shit moment. That was the same bloody teddy bear from Twisted Metal Black when Agent Stone in that game accidentally killed an innocent family in the crossfire of taking out actual terrorists, and these guys, despite just raiding the restaurant to survive, were labeled as terrorists every time someone recounted the story in the present day. Holy crap, they took one of the best stories from the games and completely recontextualized it. That right there is a man who kills justifiably, even if he messed up. But they took that backstory and instead of making him a righteous cop murdering justifiably, they made his indignation towards the quote-unquote terrorists come from a place of insecurity, when they finally pushed the wrong button and he snapped. And that insecurity permeates through his entire character in the show. That is how you take a good guy backstory and make it into a bad guy backstory without really changing anything, and it characterizes Agent Stone as a man who projects all this power but deep inside he's just a fraud, an insecure little child just wanting validation. One who exaggerates all of his accomplishments in order to keep people in line, and the accidental murder also gives his character an undercurrent of lingering trauma. That restaurant scene was the moment it dawned on me that they might actually know what they're doing here.
Baba Booey.
And I must say, Thomas Hayden Church, yes, the Sandman, brings an amazing cold, calculated composure and subtle sinister edge to the character that I absolutely love. He is joined by several other cop characters from the games, Carl and Jamie Roberts and Agent Shepard to name a few. I'd say as far as portrayals, Carl and Jamie Roberts come the closest to their in-game counterparts, except for the fact that they're villains instead of heroes. Agent Shepard, on the other hand, might just be the law enforcement character with the most established characterization that they changed the most. He's just a lieutenant of Agent Stone and is a complete and total raving lunatic psycho and a pervert. Let's just say he was caught with his pants down at one point quite literally, and what ensued was 50 shades of disturbing. They literally just took the name Agent Shepard with no connection to the actual character from head on. However, looking at his character design, I was low-key predicting that he was going to turn out to be Calypso. But that didn't work out. Now, I've gone over most of the characters, but I was honestly surprised by just how many references they made to the games. A running joke with Sweet Tooth is his best friend and main companion is Crazy Harold the Lunch Sack. It's a joke that works in the context of the show and makes for some really funny moments, but it's also a reference to his ending in the very first game. In one episode, they had a convoy of holy men led by Preacher. One episode had Miranda Watts, Flower Power, and Granny Dread. In fact, I didn't even clue into Amber being Flower Power until she used that codename. And I must say, I think of all the side characters, my favorites were definitely Miranda, aka Twister, and Amber, aka Flower Power. Miranda is this incredibly crude but tough as nails middle-aged southern so-and-so, meanwhile Amber is this very petite, unassuming, kindly little woman with a dark streak a mile long. Practically every flower she grows is designed to either hurt you or incapacitate you. So her unassuming demeanor gives way to a total badass, which is hilariously juxtaposed with her outward appearance and personality.
Tea? It's Gelsemium elegans. I cut it this morning.
And that's what I appreciate about the series as a fan, is that they can't usually 100% accurately adapt the characters from the games, because how do you adapt a character accurately when they don't really have characters? They just have brief backstories and a handful of cutscenes at best. Well, they usually took the core thematic elements of these characters and expanded upon them or changed them in order to maintain the spirit of the character while making them more interesting. Something like what they did with Flower Power is absolutely genius, or Preacher, where instead of being a crazed holy man, they made him into a crazed messianic cult leader, and for the record, Jason Mantzoukas crushes this role. He's great.
I can still hear their screams. I can't wait to hear yours.
It amazes me that they're not discriminating against which games they're referencing. Confirmed in one episode where they literally had an entire game's worth of characters sitting around a table. Pit Viper, Bloody Mary, Mr. Slam, Pizza Boy, even Drag Queen makes an appearance. I didn't think they would have the balls to ever reference that character again. And the whole thing about Pit Viper not being a milkman and instead being a secret agent working for Agent Shepard is about as deep a cut as deep cuts get for the series. Although for the record, Mr. Slam is not called Mr. Slam because of the car he drives. In fact, the reason why he's called Mr. Slam is one of the more grotesque jokes in the entire series. As a matter of fact, this series is labeled as rated R, and trust me when I say, much like Hulk Hogan in the bedroom, this is a hard R. This has everything it takes to make an adult show, short of straight up nudity, and they do get pretty close at times. So this show is definitely not for the faint of heart, especially with the violence. They're not shy about showing all the gory and unpleasant details when people are cut up, shot, etc. I have no problem with it, I enjoy my ultra-violence, but this is definitely a fair warning to anybody who has problems with gore. Personally, I actually think I have more of a problem with the excessive swearing. I think a well-placed F-bomb is a beautiful thing, but they swear so much in this show it feels juvenile at times, like the dialogue is written in service of the swearing and not the other way around. But the violence is pretty on point, like I said, and it may surprise you to find out that most of the action in this series is not actually in cars. A fair number of action scenes are actually hand-to-hand, and there's only a handful of instances in the entire series of car combat. That will probably disappoint some, but you gotta look at things in perspective. This is a TV show, and probably one without a massive budget. Plus, TV shows need to stretch the budget, so obviously they had to save the car fights for the big moments, then fill in the rest of the episodes with character interactions or hand-to-hand action. And hey, I'd rather they take a less is more approach, because if they went overboard with it, it would probably get desensitizing. Though to be fair, there were a couple of battles that were far too short. I'd say they were definitely saving their budget for the final battle in episode 10, which makes sense, and let me tell you, as a fan, the wait was worth it. I was smiling ear to friggin' ear during the final fight. I don't want to spoil any of it because, quite frankly, it is the pure essence of badass front to back. The only thing I will say is that the series makes an effort to be relatively grounded for most of its runtime, with many of the battles just being car fights with machine guns and the odd missile here and there, but the final fight in episode 10 is where they officially embrace the schlock, and it truly does feel like a live-action adaptation of a Twisted Metal level. It's glorious, though there was a missed opportunity with this fight. It would have been absolutely perfect if they blasted Dragula, seeing as that song is so intrinsically linked to Twisted Metal 3 and 4. I mean, they played Evanescence at one point, which admittedly to me made a dramatic moment unintentionally funny, not helped by it taking place after an egregious plot contrivance, but they never played Dragula. That would have tied it all up in a bow. Hopefully they at least do that for the final fight in Season 2, and if they don't, I will complain on the internet. Surprisingly, I think they actually did mostly practical effects, not just with this fight, but with most of the series, which is good, because the digital effects that are there can be a bit hit and miss. Not even necessarily in the fights, like these PS3 looking seals. Now that's uncanny. Or how about Granny Dread's obvious cheap looking mannequin? Well anyways, I don't really have a good segue for this, but I wanted to discuss the overall tonality of this series. Because one of my questions going into this series was which tone they were going to pick, seeing as the game series has encompassed multiple tones over the years. I'd say it's definitely comparable to Twisted Metal 1 and 2 in that it's definitely very campy, but still maintains a level of groundedness to where they can have the craziness exist alongside the seriousness. I've heard some people complain that it's not dark enough, but I think some people only know Twisted Metal through Black in 2012, but outside of those two games, the series has always been varying degrees of campy, and personally, I feel like the first and second games nail that balance better than most, so if they're going to pick a tone, I'm glad it's comparable to those two games. Now, I haven't really discussed the main overarching plot as it pertains to the series episode to episode, but that's because going to New Chicago to pick up the package is basically the main plot, and everything else is just the adventures that each of these factions get into on their way to the ultimate destination. They encounter a convoy of 18-wheelers operating as a mobile city, they get carjacked and have to infiltrate a compound of holy men, they get trapped at Hoover Dam and nearly die, and all plot points eventually converge going back to New San Francisco. So it's kind of a series of adventure of the day plots mixed with a main through line, which is a perfectly serviceable progression for this type of show. But you know what hasn't come up during any of this? The fact that this ostensibly takes place during an apocalypse. I think that's my biggest problem with this, is the apocalyptic scenario, because for as much lip service as they paid in the beginning of the show over this being based in an apocalypse, it never really becomes apparent that that's the case. There's always gas, electricity, food, running water, and so on. No matter where they are in the country, they're always conveniently in a place that's well stocked. So what's even the point of having this be set in an apocalyptic scenario if there's no scarcity? It might as well be a regular modern setting. I guess you could say it's not a full-on apocalypse. Certain sectors can make a recovery and return to some level of normalcy, but in some cases, especially in the rural areas, everything is so normal as to completely take me out of it. I understand that they needed to put the story in this setting in order to tell the story they wanted to, because unless society is completely collapsed, how can you justify roaming bands of psychos and cars taking over, and how can you justify segments of society that have returned to some level of normalcy, but are completely whacked out on their own rules? But you can't half-ass a scenario like this. The thing about an apocalyptic scenario is that it needs to be an apocalyptic scenario all the time. Imagine if in The Last of Us, Jackson wasn't a rural town that was barely up and running and was just a straight-up city, like a new San Francisco level city. It would be completely out of place and look absolutely absurd, completely killing believability. And hey, I know the Twisted Metal TV show is significantly less serious than The Last of Us, but so is Zombieland, and Zombieland managed to maintain its apocalyptic believability. Comedy is no excuse for sloppy writing, and to be honest, this show is a bit sloppy, but I had fun with it. For all the picking and nitpicking I can do, I genuinely had a good time watching this. It's definitely the type of show where you can turn your brain off and just have fun. It would be a real mistake to take it seriously, but that's okay because it's just plain fun when it comes down to it. Some of the humor doesn't work, but when it hits, it hits. Not all the action is spectacular, but when it hits, it hits. Not all the dramatic elements are A tier, but when it hits, it hits. I actually thoroughly enjoyed this TV series much more than I ever expected to based on those trailers. It's fun, schlocky nonsense with heart, which is exactly what I think it should have been. Although it is a bit of a misnomer to say series, when I should be saying season, because more than likely there's going to be a season 2. You see, before the release I was questioning how they could make a Twisted Metal series out of the tournament. Well, it turns out they pulled a Mortal Kombat 2021 on us in more than one way, and this season is merely the precursor to the tournament, which will take place in a hypothetical season 2. Which means we still have yet to see Calypso, at least see Calypso's face, and that's going to be the biggest cliffhanger going into the next season, which honestly I'm looking forward to. I know that's probably going to disappoint some people, and I definitely thought that it was unnecessary for Mortal Kombat 2021 not to have a tournament, but Twisted Metal is a long dormant franchise, and so they kind of needed to reintroduce the entire universe to a mass audience before they can go ahead with the main thrust of the series. Mortal Kombat has been long established, so people generally understand the lore, but if you just launched right into a tournament arc with Twisted Metal without establishing the universe or characters, that would leave a lot of people confused. I think they did the right thing here, and they did a good job with this one, at least as good of a job as they could have. And on that note, I should probably wrap up. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, D. Bettch, Gauze004, Kristopher Fulton, Leyabout, MyNameIsTank, FarmCat84, Raaf, TyTrovy, WeirdWebbster, and Cotton Swab for going above and beyond. And if you want to support the channel non-financially, you can like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Plus, leave me a comment telling me what you thought of the show. Give me a score out of 10. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!
Not a bully.